The girls took turns making meals for the makeshift hospital. They enjoyed June's cooking the most. Her mother had taught her from a young age, so she had nearly mastered the cooking skill. Most nights, Daphne and her friends were the only ones at dinner. The more experienced nurses were either assisting at other hospitals or sneaking away to see soldiers at camp. The girls often felt like outsiders. Their bonds as friends had flourished since being deployed to war-torn Windenburg. They had each developed dark senses of humor as a way to cope with the circumstances, so they joked with each other often. And June was disappointed that she had yet to meet a soldier to flirt with and convinced to marry her. Her friends reminded her that there was still plenty of time. After several months of training, the girls were finally deemed ready to help patients. Their makeshift hospital was officially open for injured soldiers as the battles were moving closer to them. Daphne still felt woefully underprepared to work on patients and attempt to save their lives after everyone else had gone to sleep. She would sneak out into the shared space and read different medical journals to feel more comfortable performing procedures. A few days after their makeshift hospital had opened its doors, a large group of wounded soldiers were ushered in. Daphne's first patient was a young man who had been hit by friendly fire. She tried to keep him comfortable and in good spirits. She performed surgery to remove what was left of the shrapnel. It was deemed successful. Daphne watched the man like a hawk during his recovery period. A few days after the surgery, the soldier collapsed due to Daphne's inexperience with surgery. Something unforeseen had gone wrong and it had costed the man his life. This turn of events hit Daphne hard. She excused herself outside and wept for a long time. That man could have had a wife or kids back home, and because of her inexperience, he would never return home. She felt unimaginable guilt. Daphne confided in June about what she had accidentally done and expressed that she didn't think she was cut out to be an army nurse. She wanted to return home to her family where she could be of more help. June allowed her friend to cry and go through all of the stages of emotion she needed to. She had yet to lose a patient but empathized with Daphne. They held the fate of soldiers in their hands, and that was scary. After Daphne dried her eyes, June tried to uplift her spirits. When that didn't work, she urged her to stick with this and reminded her the consequences of deserting in wartime. They had to be strong and do their jobs, just like the soldiers who were risking their lives. This event had caused Daphne to pick up the ciggies. She had previously declined offers to try it from other nurses, but the stress had gotten to her. She needed something to calm her nerves. She missed her family so much. She had received little correspondence from them since she had made it to Windenburg. Her way for them only added to the stress she was under. She felt like she could crack under the pressure. After several months of being apart, Matthew finally snuck away from base to see his love. This was the perfect time as Daphne had been having a rough go of it. After staring longingly at one another for a long time, as if to memorize the new details of each other's faces that the war had changed, Matthew swept Daphne off her feet in a passionate kiss. Everything felt right again for Daphne. Daphne and Matthew caught up on what had happened in their lives over the last several months, while swaying in each other's arms. It was important to learn what the other had been up to, but both had longed for the physical touch of their love. Matthew had been in several battles since deployment. He had kept his promise to Daphne that he would stay safe and away from the danger. His friend, Norman, had quickly moved up ranks for his bravery, and it weighed Matthew. Daphne shared her concerns of the war regarding Matthew and Norman with her friends. She was scared that Norman's bravery would get him hurt or worse. She was scared that her advice to Matthew would get him into trouble for being a coward. Lily reassured Daphne that Norman would be okay because this was just the type of person he was. As for Matthew, He was only doing what he thought was right, and that was staying alive to go home with Daphne. Their friend group would get through this. June joked that there was a very attractive soldier that currently needed attending to, so she would see the girls later. This left Daphne and Lily alone to talk. Lily admitted her minor crush on Norman and hoped that he would survive the war so she could tell him of her feelings. Daphne hoped that all 5 of them would make it out of the war in one piece. Daphne had been stuck with laundry duty since her colossal medical mistake that cost a man his life. She did not mind this, as she didn't think she was yet ready to operate on another soldier for the foreseeable future. She had so much more to learn before then. She often wondered what her life would be like if she never volunteered to be an army nurse. Surely her life would be worse living with Bradley. Daphne continued to sneak up into the abandoned attic to paint, with the battles creeping closer to where they were stationed. More injured soldiers were filling their beds. She barely got any time to herself. The poorly painted canvases she created were her only source of calm. Daphne could not believe nearly 2 years had passed in Windenburg and she was aging into a young adult. Her life and responsibilities would soon drastically change. She wished for she and Matthew to go home together soon. In a drastic turn of events, Daphne's young adult trait is that she is optimistic. She will always look on the bright side. Her young adult aspiration is that she wants to have successful lineage. She wants to have many kids with Matthew. Lily and June also aged into young adults soon after Daphne did. Lily wished for her father to be taken in this war, while June wished for one true love. Matthew visited Daphne a few weeks after her birthday. There was an odd tension in the air for both of them, since Daphne had aged into a young adult. She yearned to express her love to Matthew in a way they had never tried before. She expressed her want of making love to Matthew, and he was very eager to do this, the love of his life. Their first time was not at all like Daphne had envisioned. They were thousands of miles from home and in an uncomfortable cot, but it still felt perfect. Because she was with Matthew, it was nothing like she ever experienced before. On one hand, she felt minorly uncomfortable and clueless what to do. On the other hand, she felt safe and loved by Matthew, which made everything better. She had never felt closer to him. It was special, and she would never forget this moment. Before Matthew had to sneak back to base, he got down on one knee and asked Daphne to officially become his wife. Daphne had always known they would one day be husband and wife, but she was still shocked and thrilled that Matthew finally asked for her hand. She would, of course, marry the love of her life. The next morning, Daphne found Lily first. She shared all of the juicy details of the night prior. Lily was very excited for her friends. She thought that they were perfect together. Later that morning, Daphne also found June and reiterated everything that she had already shared with Lily. June was happy for her friend, but shared that she was jealous of her love story. A month later, a large group of gravely wounded soldiers were rushed in after a bomb was dropped not far from the makeshift hospital. There were many fatalities and limbs lost. Among the wounded was Norman. He had third-degree burns and had lost an eye in the attack. He had been a hero in battle, but had a long recovery to go. Daphne's world stopped turning when she discovered Matthew was among the injured. She later learned that Norman had pushed Matthew away from the blast and shielded him. Matthew would have perished if it had not been for his brave friend. Daphne sat vigil at Matthew's bedside for weeks. She was petrified that if she left his side, he would not survive. Matthew suffered a terrible concussion, burns, and a nasty leg injury that nearly resulted in amputation. He was lucky to be alive. Daphne tried to calm herself by knitting, in order to heal. Matthew slept for days and days since his concussion was so severe. She watched him sleep and gave up sleeping herself, so that she could ensure he was going to be Okay. She took drag after drag of her ciggies. She had been scared many times in her life, but never like this. Matthew was the love of her life and the man who would soon be her husband. She loved him so much. She couldn't survive if Matthew didn't make it. He had to be okay. Lily returned from helping the injured in the battlefield a few weeks later. She had been shot. She hadn't announced her presence and it had frightened an already terrified boy, and he pulled the trigger. Lily had lost a lot of blood, but the shot was through and through, so it was not a fatal wound. This experience traumatized her so much that the other nurses had thought she had gone crazy. Nobody could understand what she was saying. Lily had to be sedated because she had become so incoherent. Her wounds were treated successfully. Lily, also being injured, had nearly sent Daphne into a psychotic break as well. She sobbed at her dear friend's bedside. Slowly, Matthew's wounds began to heal because of the shape his leg was in. It was determined that he would be discharged from duty and would return home to Henford-on-Bagley in a fortnight. Matthew did not want to leave Daphne there alone. Daphne tried to remain optimistic about Matthew being discharged. At least he would be safe. She suggested that he go back home and start building a life for their future. She told him all of the things she wanted their home to have. Matthew cuddled Daphne as tightly as he could. He promised that he would find her dream home and start building their life for her and their future children. He would wait for her no matter how long the war lasted because she was his soulmate. Daphne stayed by Lily's bedside when Matthew was well enough to get up from his hospital bed. Lily's mental state had continued to deteriorate. It was determined that she would be discharged as an army nurse, and there were talks of putting her into an asylum. Daphne did not want her friend to be placed into an asylum. She tried to comfort her and talk about happy things in hopes of snapping her of the fragile mental state she was in. Daphne was tasked with the unpleasant responsibility of telling Lily that her father had perished in war. This seemed to help a little bit with the prospect of her returning home, but she was still in a very bad way and not making much sense. The day had come for Matthew to leave Weinenberg and return to Henford-on-Bagley. Daphne was utterly devastated, but she kept on a brave face for him. He kissed her passionately despite still healing from his wounds. They both wanted to remember this kiss for a long time, since they would be apart for an undetermined amount of time. Matthew promised he would start building for their future together as soon as they got home. Daphne was appreciative of Matthew's determination for building their life together and his undying devotion. And for her, she would miss him so much. Despite her best efforts to remain stone-faced and emotionless, she began to weep. She had been so strong during the last few months of his healing, but she could no longer contain her dissatisfaction or having to stay when he was going home. She didn't want to be apart from him. Lily was leaving on the same flight home that Matthew was. She screamed incoherently at Daphne, but Daphne understood the gist of her feelings. Lily was scared to return home without her friends. Daphne hugged her closest friend tightly and prayed that her fragile mind would be able to heal back in Henford-on-Bagley. As soon as Matthew and Lily left to go home, Daphne lost it. She sobbed into June's shoulder and expressed the hopelessness she felt now that Matthew was gone. She didn't want to be in Weinenberg anymore. The first few months after Matthew had been discharged from the army were relatively okay for Daphne, as she received weekly letters from him. She still missed him terribly, but each letter was filled with love and encouragement, and they kept her going. Daphne and Norman's friendship grew stronger after Matthew was gone. Both missed him deeply, and that bonded them together. They had always been distant friends because both loved Matthew. At this time allowed them to formally get to know each other. Daphne had formed an odd attachment to Norman because he saved Matthew's life. She was forever indebted to him for saving his life. She learned a lot about his upbringing and why he was so fiercely protective of those he loved. He had failed to save his sister from drowning when he was a child, so he decided to make it his life's mission to save everyone he could. That's why the army was the perfect place for him. Norman had felt very discouraged with the slow healing process of his injuries and wanted to get back to leading his men. Daphne told him jokes in an effort to cheer him up, and Norman greatly appreciated her trying to cheer him up, but he would never be fully satisfied until he was well enough to fight for his country. Again, he apologized for ever thinking that Matthew should explore other options before marrying Daphne. He came to realize how incredible of a woman she truly was. He thought Matthew was extremely lucky to have her. Daphne began to worry when a month had passed by, and she had not received a letter back from Matthew. She wrote to him obsessively in hopes that he would write back. Her mind began to wonder if he had met another woman while back at home. With the war efforts losing momentum and the number of wounded soldiers decreasing in the area, Daphne's duties were limited to cooking for the few remaining injured and keeping Norman happy as he was of higher rank. The other nurses insisted that she only help heal Norman because she knew him from back home. Daphne believed it was because she wasn't a good enough nurse. Daphne and Norman spent a lot of their time together. They ate all of their meals together. They were both unsatisfied with their situations because they wanted to be somewhere other than the hospital. They found comfort in each other because they both understood. Norman was subtle with his compliments towards Daphne, but it became clear to him that his feelings towards Daphne had shifted from platonic to infatuation. Daphne found herself occasionally flirting with Norman to ease the loneliness and longing for Matthew. It was harmless, as she only ever had eyes for Matthew. She considered Norman a close friend since he had comforted her so much since Matthew was discharged. Daphne continued to write to Matthew weekly. She had not received correspondence back in a while. She was beginning to worry that something terrible had happened to him, however. She knew that Lucy or Elizabeth would write to her if that were the case. So her mind was set on the idea that Matthew had fallen in love with someone else and was too much of a coward to tell her. If Matthew didn't love her anymore, she didn't know what she would do. Her life and future would be bleak and loveless. Norman was always there to lift her spirits and to talk sense into her. He knew Matthew very well and promised that it was not in his character to get a wandering eye. He has been set on Daphne since they were children and would never betray Daphne. Daphne wanted to believe Norman, as she had a gut feeling that told her otherwise. She tried not to jump to conclusions. As more time passed with no letter from Matthew, it became harder to hold out hope. She appreciated Norman's insight and words of encouragement so much. He had become a beacon of light in an otherwise dark chapter in her life. He made being in Windenburg tolerable. After 2 months of silence from Matthew, she decided to write a letter setting him free. This was the last thing she wanted to do, as his silence was eating her alive. She could barely eat or sleep. It was the unknown that was so unsettling for her. At least this way, she had a semblance of control and could protect her heart from getting even more broken. Who knows? Maybe she could fight for his love once she returned home. Maybe this wouldn't be the end of their love story. The week after she mailed the letter to Matthew was rough for Daphne emotionally. She still seldom slept. In an effort to calm her mind, she would sneak up to the attic in the middle of the night to paint. It did help to ease her heartbreak some. One night, Norman found her secret hiding place in the attic and came to comfort her. Before either of them knew what was happening, Norman was kissing her and Daphne was letting him. The kiss felt both wrong and so right. It was just what she needed to shut her brain off from thoughts of Matthew. She had never thought about Norman in this way previously, but now that it was happening, she wondered why she never thought about it before. Norman was an attractive man, even with his eye patch. Even if she would regret this decision in the morning, she let Norman kiss her and make her feel good. Let's check back on Matthew Barton as he settles into post-war life. Matthew bought a modest house in Willow Creek for he and his fiancée to start a family in. His concussion was still healing, so he tried to keep his mind sharp by reading. Life felt strange now that his life wasn't in danger every single day. He tried to gain some normalcy by mimicking the motions of real life, like cooking dinner every night or lighting a fire in the fireplace and basking in the warmth. He found himself taking a lot of baths because he never felt clean. The invisible grime of battle would never leave him. He spoke to Daphne often through letters, but still felt such shame and guilt for leaving her in Windenburg. He was supposed to be her protector, and he was failing her. To calm his endless nerves, his mother suggested that he take up knitting before war. He would have laughed at her because knitting is traditionally what women do. He found that it really helped as thoughts of war subside. He made a sweater for Daphne to wear once she returned home. He also began to knit baby clothes for their future children. Thinking about his future with Daphne was the only thing that kept him going some days. Sleep was the hardest for Matthew. He was plagued with flashbacks from the war and woke up in cold sweats most nights. Matthew became restless by the mundane day-to-day tasks. He had survived on pure adrenaline for years during the war, so it felt unnatural to complete basic tasks. His favorite task to complete was scrubbing his laundry. It was the middle of winter, and the frigid temperature was shocking to his system in a comforting way. It grounded him in Willow Creek. After 6 months, Matthew stopped responding to Daphne's letters. It wasn't because he was angry with her or didn't love her anymore. He simply did not want to lie to her about how he was feeling. She wanted Matthew to be okay, and he just wasn't. He tried to draw as a way to get through his battle fatigue because Daphne mentioned how much painting had helped her through her stress. He wanted to be healed enough to marry her when she returned home. Eventually, Matthew decided he would benefit from getting a job. He was too stir crazy to continue sitting at home. He also thought that starting a new career could help him to feel normal. He was unsure of which career path to take. Nothing really called to him. He struggled to make a decision for several weeks. He eventually settled on the law career. He did not have a rhyme or reason for choosing that career. He just needed to make a decision. Lucy and Elizabeth finally come to visit Matthew in his new home in Willow Creek. They do not come bearing good news. Lucy shared that there was an incident at the Bennett residence and Matthew needed to travel back to Henford on Bagley immediately. Edward and Robert were just drafted to fight in the war, and Lucy had recently suffered a factory injury that left her blind, so she could not be of service. As Lucy explained the events that occurred on the Bennett land, he shouts out in anger. Life was so unfair, and Daphne was not here to help her family through this time. He needed to step up for his fiancée's family. Lucy was devastated by what had happened, and she felt powerless to help. The accident at her factory job had completely blinded her in both eyes and could not help the family. It had become an extension of her own family. Before Matthew left for Henford on Bagley, he excused himself into his bedroom to cry. He had to tell Daphne what happened, and he knew that this news would completely destroy her. He had to be strong for her family. Matthew sat down at the kitchen table to write a letter to his betrothed that would change her life forever. He detailed the events that his mother had shared with him. He knew that Daphne would want to know every detail of what happened, so Matthew did his best to deliver that. Writing out the incident was very difficult for him. He began to weep as he was writing. He wished he was able to be there with Daphne when she read the letter so he could hold her and keep her safe.